I almost said Spanish, but it got snarled when I went to Italy and all my Italian came back. So I'm actually going to say that in the last few years, I have relearned the patterns, joys, and frustrations of being a parish priest again. For much of 20 years, I have been a diocesan person, and earlier I served in large parishes, or I started new churches. And the parish I'm serving now, which I love, is a mid to small-size parish that was in substantial decline when I arrived. And I have relearned how to do that, and it's been wonderful. I have learned things I didn't know 20 years ago, like you can text and do pastoral care. A lot of texting. Oh, I need to stay, thank you. I have learned that I can manage a lay pope and keep him in the congregation and us in relationship, and sometimes him in check and occasionally him in checkmate, like the time he decided to resign in a huff and I accepted the resignation, and he didn't expect that. I've learned even to have real spiritual conversations with that person and have learned to love him. I have learned how to deal with brutal criticism from a man who didn't come last Christmas, didn't come this Easter, and I heard was trashing me behind my back. And then I found out that his daughter-in-law was dying in another state of the same thing that his wife had died of 20 years before. And I learned to call him, and we prayed. I have learned that you can buy Lift Every Voice and Sing, the African American hymnal, which has all the golden, olden Protestant hymns and a lot of African American black hymns, for $19.95 at Walmart, which is 1/3 less than the church publishing house. And I have learned that when I snuck them into the pews when I had enough of them, there was a little bit of unconscious racism left in my parish, and that was, they took them all out of the pews because they figured they belonged to the Kenyan congregation that met in the afternoon. I have learned that bounce houses do not create an evangelistic outcome. We tried it. The neighborhood came in droves, but they didn't come back for church. And I have relearned that friends and family and neighbors are the most effective evangelists for a church, and usually you have to ask them 7 or 8 times. I've learned to work with our teens when our teens work, and learned that taking them for a weekend away is better than making them feel guilty because they can't work on weekends when I ask them to acolyte. Mostly I've just learned that I don't have to be good at everything. I have to stay focused on Christ, and I have to focus on creating good systems for a parish, good parish culture, good parish behavioral norms. We don't say that here. And I've learned to not make myself off better than I am. I am what I am, a sheep of Christ's fold, a lamb of his redeeming. And if I hadn't learned that, I would have learned it in the last 48 hours because you guys assigned me a shepherd. And I hope that all of that which I've learned, again, about the joys and sorrows of being a parish priest, would serve me well as I served as a bishop, because my primary job there would be to support and uphold the leaders of the parish, both lay and ordained. Thank you.
The second question is, how will you address the lack of clergy available for parishes, especially small parishes?
And please repeat the question for those on the webcast. Can't hear you.
How will you address the lack of clergy available for parishes, especially small parishes? This diocese had a clergy shortage for 200 years before it had a bishop. And we flourished, we managed. They recruited, they found clergy, they raised them up. Why, they started a nice place just down the street called William and Mary so they could train locally ordinands for the ministry. The revolution changed that because we had a branding problem. And for 30 years after, it didn't look like we were going to have a church in Virginia. But the second and third bishop went out and recruited and encouraged and asked people to start churches in their back parlors and on their front porches, and they did. And a lot of the early history, and probably some of the churches that you attend, were started because one or two lay people started reading morning and evening prayer and inviting clergy to come in and celebrate when they could. And clergy rose between churches. I mean, they rode on horseback. That still works. I have been in the Diocese of Dallas, and I can tell you that I have done services in places like Kaufman, Texas, which is 30 minutes from where I live. Did the 8 o'clock there, drove 3 hours and 10 minutes to, can't make this up, Atlanta, Texas, which is, by the way, north of Berlin, east of Naples, and south of Paris. But I arrived at 11 o'clock and I was almost ready to get across the railroad tracks when a 200-car freight train got between me and the church. So I got there, but not with but inches to spare. It can still be done. This profile, the profile that you have, says there are less than 20 deacons in this diocese. My goal would be to triple that. When I left the Diocese of Virginia, there were no deacons. I entered a diocese where there was a huge tradition and college of very competent deacons, and I have seen how a good deacon, locally raised up, locally trained, and energized, can hold together 2 or 3 small parishes with the help of supply clergy for years and be the pastoral presence and the community presence for that parish. I'll also say that in the middle of the country, there's a lot of dioceses that have worse clergy problems in terms than we do. And they are having summer schools for bivocational clergy. They're identifying leaders in parishes, and they are raising up people to be able to serve small and rural parishes. When I was looking for church planners, and I found quite a few, I would go across the country to conferences, to seminaries, and I'd recruit people. It would be easy to say, look, Virginia is the most wonderful place in the world to live. Come and preach the gospel and live here. And I think I've done it before. I know I've done it before. I think I could do it again. But I think the most critical thing is to remember that after the resurrection, Jesus didn't found a seminary. He started a movement. He wanted people to go out and share the good news about God, about what life was. We've got to stop believing that, we need people with a certain kind of degree and start believing that we need people with certain gifts. We can get them the education. It's not that I don't value books or theological education. I do. I've got one. But I will take a risk-taking lay leader any day, because that person can go into a community and start a ministry and change the world and revive any small town. I have, with 3 lay people, opened 2 parishes that are still open, and we did it without clergy. And it was worth doing, and they're flourishing 20-some years later. I don't have a magic wand, much less a magic mitre to say this would do it, but I think with a can-do attitude and a determination that God wants us to raise up leaders, we can both recruit, train, enable, and bless people to start where they are and create worshiping communities. And perhaps even share with one another the Eucharistic life that we have. It's not that you have to do Eucharist every Sunday. I realize, again, I'm probably going to lose a few people on that one. But I grew up where, in some parts of Virginia, morning prayer was every Sunday, and then Eucharist was every other Sunday. And it was, both were valued. You can feast on the Word as well as on the Blessed Sacrament. And I hope that by doing both, we can meet the needs we have for the clergy of the Diocese of Southern Virginia and for the parishes. Thank you.
Are there any questions from the group? There must be one question.
I have one.
Yes, sir.
And be sure and please repeat it for the webcast.
I will do so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ordained in '74 in this diocese, interim ministry had not really started. Nobody wants to be a temp.
No.
But a mentor and a dear friend, Charles Johnson, just passed away. But he preached interim ministry in 2 dioceses and recruited a lot of us. It reached its peak here in Southern Virginia. We met monthly. We had to go away to training, the official training, and it changed my life of 40-some years of ordained ministry, because by the time I've been in one city, Virginia Beach, for 25 years, it was time to go throughout the diocese and do the interim ministries in churches, interim rectors, should be said. Where are the bishops on this? Because some don't provide leadership, they don't encourage continuing education, and it seems to be falling by the wayside. And they do not also say, well, you have to be trained.
Is the question is the role of interim ministry in the
In your
diocese?
mind as a person that you were.
I have seen brilliant jobs done by interim rectors, especially necessary when there's been a conflictual situation or a long-term pastorate where there needs to be a period of time before the parish regroups and considers its next clergy leadership. So I'm very supportive of it. Can't speak for bishops, I don't know. But I think it is necessary to have, in some cases, interim clergy. And I certainly have worked well in 2 dioceses with the cadre of people, and knew Charlie Johnson. They are lifesavers to the diocesan office, frankly. Thank you. Other questions?
Canon Hurd, how do you deal with the kind of conflict that is rife in the world today, kind of alienation that we experience given the issues that divide us?
How do I deal with the conflict that is rife in the world today with the issues that divide us? Chris, I pray a lot. I think you're constantly called to remind the people of the church and the people we walk around in the world with that we have more common ground than we have division, and constantly try and find where the common ground is. And it may be simply humanity, and then you have to work forward from there. But I think it's easy to feel anxious about the divisions in the world. But if you go back through history and you read, say, revolutionary history or 8th century history, you'll find plenty of tensions and conflict. I think we've had a period of unusual quiet for maybe 20 years, and now we're back to normal human behavior, which is when there's sinners, we're going to sin, and that includes dividing one from another. But I think if the church speaks clearly for reconciliation and acts to bring us together and find those common ground. It may be as simple as bringing people together for dinner, but we got to do that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Along those same lines, there's been a fair amount of divisiveness within the Episcopal Church over the last 10 or 20 years. Do you think we were beyond that? If not, how would you deal with that?
I think there is still a variety of different opinions on a variety of issues. I go to General Convention. I have had, shall we say, heated discussions with my fellow delegates, and this was my 6th or 7th. I'm losing track. Again, I think we are getting to a point where, fortunately, we're more afraid of decline than we are of division. And that may not be a bad thing. We are united in our fear of decline. But I hope that we turn that around and become united in where we can work together. And I have stood in meetings in General Convention where very different people theologically were able to agree on some human rights and human action issues, and that was a witness for everybody.
There's a lot of veterans around this area. I'm curious how your previous experience supporting the armed forces might inform your potential position.
I was asked about how my previous experience with the armed forces might inform my position as bishop. And my response is, I'm an Army officer's daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter. And I married a man who worked for the Naval Sea Systems Command and the Pentagon for his entire ministry as a JAG officer. That's native ground to me. I understand that military people have to hit the ground running for a 3-year commitment, and clergy and the bishop need to be aware that they have great gifts to bring, and you have to bring them on almost immediately and say goodbye often, and then sometimes 6-8 years later say hello again. But I spent 4 years overseas on a paratroopers base, and then in Frankfurt am Main at 5th Corps. I've been a chaplain in both places. I think I got a little bit of that culture. One last question.
You spent a good bit of time in diocesan work. What's your perspective on finding, particularly financial resources to support the diocese?
I have worked in a diocese that had free will giving, that's Diocese of Virginia, and I worked in a diocese that has assessment, it taxes, Diocese of Dallas. I strongly prefer the first because I don't think the diocese should be a taxing organization. You might have a bottom line so much, but one of the problems with giving from parishes to the diocese is different sized parishes are able to give, in a sense, different amounts. And so I think a tiered system of suggested giving is one thing. Secondly, the bishop has to be a fundraiser, and I've done that, and has to be an unapologetic fundraiser, because a lot of new projects will not be able to be raised out of the diocesan budget. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
And with that, our time is up to move.
Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.